War and homelessness might seem like disparate issues, but in America, there is a significant and troubling connection between the two. Over the past 2 decades, the United States has poured astonishing amounts of money into overseas conflicts. From 2001 to 2023 alone, an estimated $10.4 trillion has been spent on wars abroad, a staggering investment that has shaped the nation's financial priorities and impacted countless lives both overseas and at home. In 2023 alone, the United States spent nearly $916 billion on defense, with a significant portion dedicated to overseas operations and foreign aid to allied countries like Ukraine and Israel. As wars rage overseas, the consequences ripple back home, touching every corner of American life. Military conflict can lead to inflationary pressures that push vulnerable populations into poverty and homelessness. In 2022, we watched in horror as the war in Ukraine unfolded, sending shockwaves through the global economy. The conflict not only caused immense human suffering, but also triggered a series of economic repercussions that rippled. One of the most significant impacts was the surge in inflation rates, which soared to 12.5% in the United States. This unprecedented rise in prices had far-reaching consequences, including an increase in homelessness. In the United States, this inflationary pressure hit low-income families the hardest, as they struggled to afford basic necessities. The rising cost of housing, in particular, pushed many people out of their homes, contributing to a spike in homelessness. Families with children are also disproportionately affected by these rising costs. In January 2024 alone, 216,100 children experienced homelessness, a 27% increase from 2020, and a shocking 64% jump since 2014. Parents who previously relied on modest but steady incomes now find that their wages can no longer keep up with the cost of even basic needs. Stories are emerging of parents working multiple jobs, yet still falling behind on rent, while others, unable to find affordable housing, move with their children into overcrowded shelters or, worse, end up on the streets. In Florida, one family's story paints a heartbreaking picture of resilience in the face of mounting economic pressure. Their small grocery business, once a modest but reliable livelihood, was hit hard by the relentless rise in food and fuel costs. Profits dwindled, and soon their savings were gone. With no safety net left, the family found themselves sleeping in their van, seeking refuge in different parking lots each night. For the parents, the reality was grim, but the hardest part was watching their 2 children adjust to life without the stability of a home. Once full of excitement at the start of each school year, their kids now face the harsh realities of homelessness, trying to focus on schoolwork from the cramped quarters of their van. As inflation continues to soar, more Americans find themselves struggling to keep a roof over their heads. A 2023 report from the Annual Homeless Assessment Report, HAR, highlights that nearly 60% of those experiencing homelessness were unsheltered, living in cars or on the streets. The impact of chronic homelessness is equally troubling. In 2024, an estimated 502,000 Americans were experiencing chronic homelessness, a stark reminder of the steep economic challenges these individuals face in trying to rebuild their lives. Those in this category, many of whom are aging or suffering from physical and mental health issues, have little hope of escaping homelessness due to the skyrocketing cost of essentials. The United States is facing a growing crisis of homelessness, one that has deepened under the strain of inflation and surging costs of living. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, an estimated 1.8 million people experienced homelessness on a single night in 2022. This figure represents a significant increase of 25% compared to 2021, highlighting a worsening trend that underscores the severity of the situation. Notably, this rise in homelessness nearly doubled the inflation rate of 12.5% in the United States for the same year, amplifying the crisis. America's next war crisis. Is America heading toward a new conflict over Israel? The prospect of the United States engaging in another war zone in the Middle East, particularly in support of Israel, raises significant concerns about the domestic economic repercussions. History has shown that military engagements abroad often come with substantial financial costs, which can exacerbate inflation and, consequently, increase homelessness in America. War is an expensive endeavor, both for the government that funds it and the citizens who ultimately bear the brunt of the cost. Military interventions require significant allocations for defense, equipment, personnel, and support operations. In recent decades, U.S. involvement in the Middle East has cost trillions of dollars, with the Iraq and Afghanistan wars alone estimated to have a total cost of over $6 trillion when including health care and disability for veterans. These wars added directly to the national debt and strained public resources that could have otherwise been used for domestic needs, like affordable housing, health care, and infrastructure. In the event of another U.S.-backed conflict in the Middle East, government expenditures will increase yet again, drawing funds away from programs that directly benefit Americans. This redirection of resources impacts social services, including housing initiatives and public assistance programs. In a world of finite resources, each dollar spent on war is a dollar diverted from addressing homelessness, affordable housing, and community development in America. Middle Eastern conflicts tend to disrupt global oil supplies, especially if they involve key oil-producing nations. The Middle East supplies around 31% of the world's oil, and any instability in the region can cause prices to surge. Rising oil prices lead to higher transportation and production costs across industries, inflating the prices of goods on store shelves and further straining household budgets. In 2024, the U.S. military budget reached an astounding $969.8 billion. This figure represents a significant portion of the federal budget, accounting for approximately 13.3% of the entire federal expenditure. This funding covers maintaining overseas bases and supporting defense contractors. Moreover, the U.S. spends billions annually on ongoing operations in various global regions, as well as foreign aid to allies for military support and defense initiatives. In stark contrast to military funding, America's budget for housing and homelessness prevention is comparatively minimal. In 2023, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development (HUD) was allocated around $51.9 billion, including funds designated for affordable housing initiatives, public housing improvements, and rental assistance programs. While significant, this allocation is less than 1/10 of the military budget. The stark financial contrast becomes even clearer when we break down the numbers. For instance, this year, military aid to Israel alone reached $25.9 billion. This support reinforces an enduring alliance and addresses regional security concerns, but it also comes with a high price tag. Similarly, since 2022, the U.S. has allocated approximately $114 billion to support Ukraine, an effort aimed at countering Russian aggression and maintaining stability in Europe, a figure that could provide affordable housing for thousands of individuals. Meanwhile, America's housing crisis has escalated to a critical level. Millions of Americans struggle to afford a home, with rising rent costs, stagnant wages, and a shortage of affordable housing units, creating a perfect storm of housing insecurity. According to recent data, nearly 2.2 million people experience homelessness on any given night in the United States. Beyond this, millions more live paycheck to paycheck, one crisis away from losing their housing. The cost of addressing housing needs is not insignificant, but it pales in comparison to war spending. For example, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition estimates that solving the affordable housing crisis would require an annual investment of around $40 billion, a figure that, while substantial, is still less than half of what the U.S. has spent on military aid to Ukraine in just 2 years. With even a fraction of war funding redirected toward housing, the U.S. could build thousands of affordable housing units, expand rental assistance programs, and provide comprehensive support services for those on the brink of homelessness. Similarly, the $25.9 billion in military aid to Israel this year alone could fund numerous housing projects and services. The average cost to build a single affordable housing unit in the U.S. ranges from $200,000 to $300,000. Even on the high end, this $25.9 billion could produce roughly 85,000 new housing units, providing stability for thousands of families and individuals. These investments would not only address housing insecurity, but also contribute to local economies, reduce healthcare costs associated with homelessness, and foster safer, healthier communities. How war drives inflation, and how inflation fuels the homeless crisis. Inflation is the increase in prices over time, reducing the purchasing power of money. When the government increases war funding without a corresponding increase in revenue, it often resorts to borrowing. This borrowing increases the national debt, and as the debt grows, so does the interest that must be paid on it. This can lead to a cycle of borrowing and spending that fuels inflation. The injection of large amounts of money into the economy through military spending can also increase demand for goods and services, pushing up prices. As inflation rises, the cost of living increases. Prices for basic necessities such as food, housing, and healthcare climb, stretching the budgets of American households. Those with lower incomes are hit the hardest, as their wages often do not keep pace with rising prices. This economic pressure forces many to the brink of financial instability, making it difficult to cover monthly expenses. The ripple effects of this economic strain are particularly visible in the housing market. As housing costs rise, both in terms of rent and home prices, many individuals and families find themselves unable to afford stable housing. The lack of affordable housing options leads to an increase in homelessness. This is compounded by cuts to social services and housing assistance programs, as federal resources are diverted to fund war abroad. Consider the story of John, a factory worker who lost his job due to economic downturns exacerbated by inflation. Despite his best efforts to find new employment, the rising cost of living outpaced his income. John and his family were evicted from their apartment and forced to live in the street. The instability and stress took a severe toll on their physical and mental health, illustrating the far-reaching impact of economic hardships. The link between military spending, inflation, and homelessness is clear. As the cost of essentials rises, more individuals and families find themselves unable to make ends meet, leading to increased homelessness. Addressing this issue requires a comprehensive approach that includes economic policies to curb inflation, investments in affordable housing, and support services to assist those at risk of homelessness. By reevaluating spending priorities and focusing on the welfare of its citizens, the United States can begin to mitigate the impacts of homelessness and build a more equitable and secure future. As federal budgets prioritize defense spending, essential programs aimed at alleviating poverty and homelessness face cuts or stagnant funding. This lack of investment in social safety nets leaves vulnerable populations without the necessary support to achieve stability and secure housing. For instance, programs that provide housing assistance, mental health services, and job training are often the first to suffer when budget constraints arise. The issue is not whether ally security is important. Undoubtedly, it is. But the cost of prioritizing war spending over domestic welfare is a pervasive homelessness crisis that could be mitigated with even a small reallocation of funds. A more balanced approach to spending, one that considers the essential needs of American citizens alongside global defense commitments, could lead to profound social and economic benefits. Ensuring that every American has access to stable housing would not only improve quality of life, but would also support a healthier, more resilient society. In the long term, investing in housing as diligently as we invest in defense could lead to a stronger and more secure nation, where every individual has a foundation they need to thrive. By reconsidering how our national resources are allocated, we can move closer to ending the homelessness crisis and building a society that values security, both abroad and at home.